The funny thing about fear is how it creeps up on you, slow and subtle, like frost forming on a window pane. You don't notice it at first, but once it takes hold, it's impossible to ignore. I've worked plenty of night jobs before, convenience stores, warehouses, you name it. But Union Station? That's different. That's something else entirely. You might have visited during the day. Maybe you've admired those soaring ceilings that stretch up into shadow, or the way sunlight filters through those massive arched windows, painting patterns on the marble floors. During the day, it's beautiful, historic, a testament to American architecture and ambition. But at night, those same architectural features transform into something sinister. Those towering ceilings become infinite voids that swallow sound. Those elegant windows turn into dark mirrors, reflecting things that shouldn't be there. And that marble floor? Every footstep echoes like a gunshot, announcing your presence to whatever lurks in the shadows. I need to tell you about what happens here after midnight. Not because I want to scare you. God knows I wish I could forget everything myself. But because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what's happening in this place when the crowds leave and the lights dim. Maybe then, somebody can make sense of it all. Let me start from the beginning. My name's Peter Marshall, and I took the night security position at Union Station 3 weeks ago. I wish I could say I quit after what I saw, but the truth is, I don't think I can leave anymore. The station won't let me. That first night seemed ordinary enough, at least at first. The evening cleaning crew had just left, their vacuum tracks still visible in the carpet of the administrative offices. The air held that peculiar mix of industrial cleaner and the lingering perfume of hundreds of daily visitors. Doug, the station manager, met me by the security desk. He was one of those men who looked like he'd been old forever. Skin weathered like dried leather, eyes sharp but distant, as if he was always looking through you rather than at you. His cigarette-roughened voice scraped against the silence as he walked me through the basics. "Keys," he said, dropping a heavy ring into my palm. "Master set. Don't lose them." The metal felt unnaturally cold against my skin. "Security office is your base. Cameras cover most areas, but you'll need to do rounds every 2 hours. Mark them in the logbook. Standard stuff, really." But then he stopped at an old wooden cabinet behind the security desk. Inside sat this antique lantern, the kind you might see in a museum. Its glass was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and the metal frame had darkened with age into something almost black. "This," Doug said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, "is your most important tool." He lifted it carefully, reverently, like a priest handling a sacred relic. "If the power goes out, and it will go out, you light this. Not your flashlight, not your phone. This lantern." I started to ask why, but he cut me off. "No questions. Just do it. And whatever happens, don't let it go out before sunrise." That's when I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he put the lantern back. "One more thing," he added, not meeting my eyes. "You'll hear things. See things, maybe. Best to keep your eyes forward and your mouth shut. This place, it has rules. Learn them quick." He left me there, his footsteps echoing until they faded into nothing. I remember sitting at the security desk, watching the monitors, thinking he was just trying to spook the new guy. But as the night wore on, I started noticing things. Little things at first. The way the shadows seemed to move when they shouldn't. The soft whispers that could almost be the ventilation system, but weren't quite right. The feeling of being watched, even when the cameras showed every corner was empty. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I had convinced myself it was all in my head, just my imagination running wild in a big empty building. But as I was leaving, I swear I heard something. A whistle, faint and far away, even though no trains run through Union Station anymore. And when I looked back at the building, just for a moment, I thought I saw someone standing at one of the upper windows. They raised their hand as if waving goodbye. I waved back before I could stop myself. That was my first mistake. The second night started with a headache and the taste of cheap coffee lingering on my tongue. I'd barely slept, my dreams haunted by the echo of that phantom whistle. But bills don't pay themselves, so there I was, back at the station as the sun dipped below the horizon. The cleaning crew left earlier than usual. I noticed because the vacuum tracks were already starting to fade from the carpet when I arrived. The air felt different too, heavier somehow, like the moments before a thunderstorm. I was halfway through my first round when it happened. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The darkness that followed wasn't natural. It seemed to press against my skin, thick and almost liquid. My flashlight clicked on automatically, muscle memory taking over, but its beam seemed weak, as if the darkness was actively fighting it. Doug's warning echoed in my mind. Get to the lantern. Don't ask questions. I made it back to the security office, my hands fumbling with the keys. The lantern sat there, waiting, its cracked glass catching what little light remained. With trembling fingers, I struck a match. The wick caught immediately, almost eagerly, and warm light flooded the room. That's when the shadows began to dance. At first, I thought it was just the lantern's flame casting normal shadows. But normal shadows don't move like that. Don't arrange themselves into words. Don't tell you things you never wanted to know. They crawled across the walls, forming letters, then words, then complete sentences. Each rule appeared and lingered just long enough to burn itself into my memory. Do not walk onto the platform unless the clock strikes midnight. Never extinguish the lantern before sunrise. Do not speak to anyone who isn't on the schedule. If the train whistle blows, stay away from the tracks. Do not touch luggage that wasn't here at the start of your shift. If the lantern flickers, run. Do not look directly at the passengers. As I read each rule, the temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in visible puffs, even though it was midsummer. The shadows twisted and writhed, and beneath their movement, I could have sworn I heard whispering, dozens of voices speaking in languages I didn't understand. The last rule appeared differently. Instead of forming from the shadows, it seemed to carve itself into the wall, letter by letter. Break these rules, and we keep you. Then the power came back on. The fluorescent lights hummed to life, and the shadows retreated to their corners like nothing had happened. But the carved words remained, a permanent reminder that this wasn't a dream or hallucination. I spent the rest of my shift in the security office, watching the monitors with one eye and the lantern with the other. Every so often, I'd catch movement on the screens, a flicker of something that looked almost human but wasn't quite right. And sometimes, when I looked at the rules carved into the wall, they seemed to shift and change, as if they were alive. Just before sunrise, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the office. Heavy steps, like someone wearing old-fashioned boots. They stopped right outside my door. A shadow passed beneath it, and I held my breath. Then a piece of paper slid under the door. On it, in handwriting that looked decades old, was a single sentence. Welcome to the night shift. Don't disappoint us. By my third night, exhaustion had started to set in. Sleep didn't come easily anymore, not with the rules playing on repeat in my head. not with the lingering fear that I might wake up back at the station even if I didn't go to work. The building had wormed its way into my subconscious, making itself at home in my nightmares. I arrived early that night, hoping to give myself time to check every corner of the station before my shift officially started. The cleaning crew was still there, but something was off about them. Their movements were too mechanical, too synchronized, and when they left, they didn't say goodbye like usual. They just stopped cleaning mid-motion, turned as one, and walked out. The rules had become my mantra. I repeated them under my breath as I made my rounds, the lantern swaying gently in my hand. The station felt different tonight, more awake somehow. The marble floors seemed to pulse beneath my feet, and the air had a metallic taste that made my teeth ache. It was 11:57 p.m. when I heard the whistle. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, distant at first, but growing closer. It wasn't the shrill blast of a modern train. This was deeper, more resonant, the kind of sound that belonged to steam engines in a bygone era. The rule was clear. If the train whistle blows, stay away from the tracks. But something pulled at me, an urge I couldn't explain. The whistle called again, and my feet moved of their own accord. Each step toward the platform felt like wading through molasses, the air growing thicker, colder. The platform entrance loomed before me, its archway seeming taller, darker than usual. The clock read 11:59 p.m. Not midnight, not time. The rule echoed in my head. Do not walk onto the platform unless the clock strikes midnight. I stopped at the threshold, fighting the compulsion to step forward. The whistle sounded again, closer now, and with it came the rhythmic chunk, chunk, chunk of wheels on tracks that hadn't felt a train's weight in decades. That's when I saw her. She stood at the far end of the platform, her figure a dark silhouette against the deeper darkness beyond. Her dress belonged to another century, high-necked, full-skirted, the kind you see in sepia photographs of people long dead. Her hair was pinned up in an elegant bun, but something about it seemed wrong, like it was moving slightly even though there was no wind. "Ma'am?" My voice cracked as I called out. "The station's closed. You can't be here." She didn't respond, but she did move. One step closer to the edge of the platform, her movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Everything in me screamed to run, to get back to the security office and lock the door. But I was a security guard, wasn't I? This was my job. I had to check on her. I stepped onto the platform. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted. Frost crystallized on the lantern's glass, and my breath came out in thick white clouds. The woman turned, and I saw her face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin, like an artist's mannequin. She opened what should have been her mouth, and the whistle sound came from her. Not the sound of a train this time, but a scream that contained every lonely cry of every passenger who had ever been left behind. I ran. Behind me, I heard the chunk, chunk, chunk growing louder, accompanied by the screech of brakes that hadn't moved in years. But I didn't look back. I clutched the lantern and ran until I reached the security office, slamming the door behind me. When I finally caught my breath and looked at the clock, it read midnight exactly. On the wall, beneath the carved rules, new words had appeared. First warning: there won't be a second. After the incident on the platform, I spent hours researching Union Station's history. Police reports mentioned disappearances over the years, travelers who walked into the station and never walked out. The official records blamed runaways, suicides, people starting new lives. But now I wondered if there was more to those stories. I was deep in these thoughts during my fourth night when I found the suitcase. The main hall had been empty during my 2 a.m. round. I was certain of it. But when I returned at 3 a.m., there it sat in the center of the marble floor, as if it had materialized from thin air. Old leather, worn at the corners, with brass fixtures dulled by decades of handling. The initials HT were embossed on the side in faded gold leaf. The rule flashed through my mind: do not touch luggage that wasn't here at the start of your shift. I circled it slowly, keeping 3 feet of distance, my lantern held high. The air around the suitcase felt wrong. While the rest of the station held summer's warmth, the space near the luggage radiated winter. Frost patterns formed and melted on the marble floor around it, creating shifting designs that made my eyes hurt. Then the tapping started. At first, I thought it was just water in the old pipes. But it didn't echo like it should. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, following me as I moved. Like someone drumming their fingers, waiting impatiently. When I completed my circle of the suitcase, I noticed the latches had changed. They were undone now, though I hadn't touched them, hadn't even come close. The lid lifted slightly, just a crack, and a smell wafted out. Mothballs and old fabric, yes, but underneath that, something sweeter, something rotten. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Movement caught my eye, a shadow passing through my lantern's light. I spun around, but the hall was empty. When I turned back, the suitcase was open. Inside lay a conductor's hat, the fabric moth-eaten and stained with something dark. Beneath it, yellowed papers spilled out like dead leaves. Train schedules, all dated 1923. And at the bottom, a single ticket, written in red ink that looked too fresh, too wet. One-way passage, final destination. The tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard breathing behind me, slow, ragged breaths that didn't sound human. I kept my eyes on the suitcase, too terrified to turn around. In the polished marble floor, I saw a reflection, a tall, dark figure in an old conductor's uniform. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its hands, skeletal fingers still tapping against its thigh. A whisper came, dry as autumn leaves. "Your ticket's coming, Peter. Soon." I ran back to the security office and locked the door. When I finally gathered the courage to check the monitors, the suitcase was gone, but the ticket lay on my desk, the red ink still wet to the touch. Night 5 began with the phones going dead. Not just the station's landlines. My cell phone showed no signal, as if the building itself was blocking any connection to the outside world. The security cameras flickered with static, showing glimpses of figures walking through walls, disappearing into floors, rising from shadows. At 11:45 p.m., the first tremor hit. A deep vibration that started in the foundation and rose through the walls, making the windows hum in their frames. The lantern's flame danced wildly, though there was no wind. In its light, the shadows on the walls began to move, forming words I hadn't seen before. "The 11:59 is arriving early tonight." I felt it before I heard it. A pressure change that made my ears pop, followed by the distant sound of steel wheels on phantom tracks. The building groaned like a living thing, marble floors rippling like water. The temperature plummeted until I could see my breath, crystallizing in the air before me. Then came the whistle. Not the lonely cry from before, but a full-throated scream of steam and steel that shook dust from the ceiling. The sound pulled at something deep in my chest, an ache that felt ancient and familiar at the same time. I found myself moving toward the platform, the lantern leading the way. The rules screamed in my head. Stay away from the tracks. "Don't look at the passengers," but my feet carried me forward anyway. The station seemed to shift around me, corridors stretching and twisting until I couldn't tell if I'd walked for minutes or hours. When I reached the platform, everything stopped. The tremors, the whistle, even the dust in the air hung suspended like stars in a dead sky. In that perfect silence, I heard it. The rhythmic clicking of wheels on rails, growing closer. The train emerged from the darkness like a nightmare, solidifying. It was both there and not there, a massive black shape that seemed to absorb my lantern's light. Steam billowed from its engine in shapes that looked almost human before dissolving. The wheels turned silently now, defying physics, and every window was dark except for occasional flashes of pale faces pressed against the glass. The doors opened with a hiss of phantom steam, and they began to exit. They moved like broken film footage, stuttering and jumping between steps. Men in suits from every decade of the last century. Women in dresses that had rotted away to show the bones beneath. Children clutching toys that leaked sawdust and shadows. None of them touched the ground. They hovered inches above the platform, drifting rather than walking. Their faces were blank, smooth expanses of skin with occasional ripples where features should be. Some turned toward me as they passed, empty faces rippling into almost smiles. A child stopped in front of me, her dress style placing her somewhere in the 1950s. Where her eyes should have been, there were only deep hollows that seemed to go on forever. She held up a doll that looked like it had been carved from darkness itself. "Will you play with me?" she asked, her voice echoing like it came from the bottom of a well. "The last guard did. He plays with me forever now." I squeezed my eyes shut, remembering the rule. Do not look directly at the passengers. When I opened them again, she was gone, but her laugh lingered, bouncing off the walls like broken glass. The sixth night brought rain, not outside, but inside the station. It fell from the vaulted ceiling in slow, heavy drops that evaporated before hitting the floor. Each droplet caught the lantern's light like a tiny prism, casting microscopic rainbows that writhed and twisted into impossible shapes. I sat in the security office, watching the monitors flicker between static and images that couldn't be real. Crowds of passengers from different eras occupying the same space, their forms overlapping and merging. A woman in a 1940s dress walked through a businessman from the 1980s. A child from the early 1900s played with a smartphone-wielding teenager from last year. The lantern's flame had been steady until midnight. Then it started to dance. At first, just small fluctuations, like a breeze was disturbing it. But there was no breeze. The air had become thick and still, like being underwater. The flame wavered more violently, and the shadows it cast began to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The rule was clear. If the lantern flickers, run. But where could I run? The station had changed around me over the past 6 nights. Corridors didn't lead where they should. Doors opened to blank walls or endless staircases. And always, the sound of that phantom train grew closer. The flames sputtered, nearly going out. In that moment of near darkness, I heard them. Footsteps in the hallway outside. Dozens of them moving in perfect synchronization. The door handle began to turn. I grabbed the lantern and fled through the other exit, the one that had appeared on my 3rd night. The footsteps followed, never getting closer but never falling behind. The flame flickered more frantically now, and the shadows it cast showed glimpses of my pursuers. A parade of former passengers, their forms twisted by time and darkness. The station twisted around me as I ran. Walls rippled like curtains in the wind. The marble floor became transparent, showing the skeletal remains of trains long forgotten in the depths below. And everywhere, the shadows danced and whispered, "Your time is almost up. The last train is coming. No one leaves without a ticket." I ran until I found myself back at the security office, though I could have sworn I'd been running away from it. The lantern's flame was barely there now, a tiny blue flicker that barely held the darkness at bay. On the desk sat a fresh bottle of oil, next to a note written in familiar red ink, "Feed it, or it feeds on you." My hands shook as I refilled the lantern. The flame steadied, grew stronger, and the footsteps faded. But in the monitors, I could see them waiting. Dozens of figures standing perfectly still in every corridor, their blank faces turned toward the camera, waiting for the flame to die. The last night was different. I knew it the moment I arrived and found Doug waiting in the security office. He looked older than when I'd last seen him, decades older, though it had been less than a week. "You lasted longer than most," he said, his voice carrying the weight of long years. "But it's time." "Time for what?" He smiled, but the expression wasn't kind. "The changing of the guard." The lantern flickered violently then, its flame turning a deep, arterial red. Doug's form seemed to shift in its light, decades of age falling away and piling on in rapid succession, like watching a time lapse of a human life. "You see, Peter, every station needs its guardian, its conductor." His uniform changed as he spoke, becoming older, more formal, until he wore the attire of a 19th century railroad man. "I've held this post for 97 years, since my own last train arrived." The walls of the security office faded away, revealing the platform. But not the platform as it existed now. This was Union Station in its glory days, steam and smoke, and hundreds of passengers rushing to and fro. Except they weren't really passengers, not anymore. Their faces were blank, their movements mechanical. "The station feeds on them," Doug explained. "On their journeys, their hopes, their despair. But it needs a conductor to keep order, to enforce the rules." He pulled out a punch ticket, the kind conductors used to carry. "My shift is over. Your final ticket has arrived." The phantom train screamed in the distance, closer than ever before. The lantern's flame twisted into impossible shapes, casting shadows that wrote new rules on every surface. The conductor must never leave. The conductor must maintain order. The conductor must feed the station. "No," I tried to say, but my voice came out as steam and whistle smoke. Doug's form began to fade. "You could have walked away the first night, Peter, but you read the rules. You played the game. And now..." He gestured to my reflection in the station's windows. My uniform had changed, become older. My face rippled like disturbed water. "The station chose you. Welcome to the night shift, the eternal shift." The train arrived then, but it wasn't a train at all. It was every train that had ever passed through Union Station, overlaid and intertwined. A massive construct of steel and steam and screaming souls. As it pulled into the station, I felt myself changing, becoming something else. Something older. Something bound to the station by rules written in shadow and sealed with lantern light. I still walk these halls every night. The lantern doesn't flicker anymore. It's part of me now. Its flame burning with the same shadows that flow through my veins. I understand the rules differently now. See them for what they really are. Not warnings, but a maintenance manual for reality itself. The passengers come and go, lost souls caught between destinations. Some know they're dead. Most don't. I punch their tickets and guide them to their final platform, while above us, the living walk through Union Station's daylight hours, never knowing how thin the barrier is between their world and ours. Sometimes I see new guards on the night shift. They never last long. Either they run after the first night, or they stay too long and become like me, part of the station's eternal staff. I try to warn them in my way. Leave the rules where they can find them, but they never listen. They never run soon enough. If you're reading this, and you're thinking about taking the night shift at Union Station, don't. But if you do, if you're drawn to this place like I was, remember the rules. And when you see me walking the halls in my conductor's uniform, lantern held high, don't look too closely at my face. You won't like what you see there. After all, I don't punch tickets anymore. I collect souls.